Hey, this is Mohal Joshi from Los Angeles, California. I follow Indian foreign policy and defense with a special focus on Asia. You can follow me on Twitter at Mohal Joshi.
Hey, this is Kishor from Bengaluru in India. I am an international relations expert specializing in global security, conflict resolution, and international negotiation. My focus areas include peace building and digital diplomacy. You can find me on Twitter at Veggie Diplomat. Hello, and welcome to episode 2 of India Rising Strategic Affairs Conversations with Mohal and Kishor. At the end of episode 1, published on August 15th, we had indicated that we will have regular episodes every Monday starting August 27th. But with the demise of our ex-Prime Minister Atal Bihari Vajpayee, we decided to advance our second episode by a week and discuss the achievements and legacy of Vajpayee in the realm of foreign policy. Enough ink has been poured over paper to discuss the legacy of Vajpayee as a poet, administrator, politician, and a prime minister. But we at India Rising felt that an entire episode needs to be devoted to foreign policy decisions taken by him. So without further ado, let's start the discussion. We pick up from when he was the External Affairs Minister from March 1977 to July 1979 in the Janata Party government headed by Morarji Desai.
Yeah, interestingly, I don't know if a lot of people don't know that. It's very well known that he was prime minister from 98 to 2004, but a lot of people don't know that he was also an external affairs minister in the Morarji Desai government.
That's right, and a very successful one at that. So one such event was when he went to the United Nations General Assembly, and mind you, it was a brand new young government, the first non-Congress government, and it was right after the elections that were held post lifting of the emergency.
Yeah.
So Vajpayee and on behalf of Morarji Desai had to convince the world that they were there to ensure that democracy would be respected within India. So his speech actually given in Hindi, he delivered it in chaste Hindi. So while doing that, he emphasized on India's commitment to democracy, not only within India but also outside India. And back then there was some issue going on in the African continent, so he kind of emphasized on the abolition of colonialism and also apartheid out there in Africa, and all this while reiterating the message of peace. And what was striking was that he ended the speech with the phrase Jai Jagat, which was actually which could loosely be translated to "Glory be to the world."
Yeah, and then on during his tenure as the external affairs minister, Vajpayee did visit Beijing, China. So this was a landmark visit because, as you know, in 1962 we fought a bitter war with the Chinese, and we didn't have diplomatic relations for a long time. But interestingly, what happened is when Vajpayee visited Beijing in 1979, it unfortunately coincided with China's invasion of Vietnam, which they wanted to punish them for supporting Cambodia. So, for having, entered Cambodia against their regime there. So, and then it is said that Deng Xiaoping, who was the leader in China at that time, mentioned to Vajpayee that the reason they had invaded Vietnam was to teach China a lesson somewhat similar to the language they use against India, that they had to teach a lesson to India in 1962. So this really enraged the Indians and Vajpayee, who cut short his visit in protest against this language used by the Chinese.
Interesting. Okay, so let's fast forward to when he was the leader of the opposition in the Lok Sabha from 1993 to 1996, when P.V. Narasimha Rao was the prime minister. So there is an interesting story of how P.V. Narasimha Rao, the then prime minister, chose Atal Bihari Vajpayee, the then leader of opposition, to represent India at the United Nations Human Rights Commission conference in Geneva in Switzerland. Pakistan had actually tried to corner India by claiming that there were human rights violations happening in the state of Jammu and Kashmir, and had brought up a proposal for the UNHRC to pass a resolution intending to condemn India's apparent high-handedness in dealing with the sectarian problems out there. So India had to respond, and Narasimha Rao, to everybody's surprise, sent Vajpayee as the main representative. And in his team was actually people like Farooq Abdullah, Salman Khurshid, Hamid Ansari, and also Manmohan Singh. All big names right now. So hectic lobbying, intense speeches, narratives and counter narratives were floated. There were many rounds of parleying. India managed to do just enough to convince the rest of the countries to force Pakistan to withdraw its proposal. Vajpayee and his team had actually won the day for India by defeating Pakistan's proposal. Excitement out there in Geneva that day was nothing short of a India-Pakistan cricket match. Fittingly, when they returned to Delhi, they were given a rousing welcome at the airport, usually reserved for victorious cricket teams.
Yeah, I mean, I remember back then also when I was young that this was a huge event where secured a spectacular victory in this, and also shows the magnanimity of PV Narasimha Rao, that he chose a leader
Absolutely.
of opposition, shows the bipartisanship at that time, which I think would be impossible in today's day and age.
And also the camaraderie between the two giants,
Yeah,
Vajpayee
I
and
mean,
Narasimha
they
Rao.
had a very good friendship.
Yes.
So, moving on to 1998, when they had a short government being formed. Um, so, they had a short 13-month government formed from 1998. So, one of the pivotal decisions I think everybody knows was to conduct testing of nuclear weapons. So BJP, interestingly, in its earlier avatar, the Jansang had always advocated for the testing of nuclear weapons and India to be an overtly nuclear state. Now, Jansang was one of the loudest proponents of welcoming the 1974 the peaceful nuclear explosion, at its called the testing in Pokhran. Now, by 1995, there was pressure building up on India to sign the CTBT, or what is called the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, and also there was negotiations ongoing to for the renegotiating the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, the NPT, which had been active for 24 years and it was going to be extended. So India was caught in kind of a bind that it would be under severe pressure to test it, or that opportunity would be lost forever. So there have been a lot of declassified CIA reports and reporting in the media that the PV Narasimha Rao government had wanted to test in 1995, but then had to back off once the testing was declared, and it was also reported in the Western media. The reason cited was that the nation, it was like first that they were caught, and later on they didn't want to test it because they didn't want the incoming government, because it was at the right at the end of Narasimha Rao's tenure. So he didn't want the newly elected government to face the economic implications of the testing.
And in fact, what happened was that PV Narasimha Rao also did a one-on-one meeting with APJ Abdul Kalam and Vajpayee, who was the PM designate in 1996, so that he could bring Vajpayee up to speed on the progress made thus far. And what followed thereafter was nearly 2 years of political instability, which we all know, with three PMs in 2 years. And this was followed by fresh elections in 1998, by which time BJP on its part had indicated that in its election manifesto they would go ahead with testing the nuclear bombs. Um and finally, when they won the elections and came back to power in early 1998, they actually went ahead and tested the nuclear bombs on 11th and 13th of May 1998 at Pokhran again. After the tests were conducted on these 2 days, the Vajpayee government clearly indicated that it had now done a self-imposed moratorium on any further testing, as they did not have to do any more testing thereafter, and also reiterated India's no first use nuclear policy, all along advocating a credible minimum deterrence. So here's an interesting tidbit for all the listeners
So
out there.
one last point. So one of the things they did this was to show that the no first use policy and a moratorium on further nuclear weapons testing was to show that, as Kishore you mentioned, that it was the credible minimum deterrence has been proved, and also to show that India was a responsible power and the West didn't have to worry about like nuclear proliferation issues or
Right.
India being an irresponsible. Some of the things which like countries like North Korea today are facing as whether they'll be a nuclear responsible power. So India wanted to set an example to allay all the fears of the West, which had come down heavily with sanctions during that time.
Exactly. So that's where the no first use nuclear policy comes into picture, where India clearly mentioned that we would use it only if we are attacked with the nuclear weapons
And
and
also
not otherwise.
even the policy also interestingly, I mean, it's slightly diverging from like the point, like also the biological and chemical weapons attack can be considered as conditions for using nuclear weapons
Right. Yeah. That is the nuclear. That is the nuclear strategic policy of
doctrine.
India. Yeah. Yeah. Correct. Okay. So coming back to where we were, here's an interesting tidbit for all the listeners out there. BJP is the only political party in the world to have mentioned in its election manifesto that it would go ahead with conducting nuclear tests. This was, and it is still a first for a political party in a vibrant democracy to ask for people's mandate and then proceed with carrying out the nuclear test. Uh, Thereafter, inevitably, the United Nations
Yeah, and
Security
then
Council.
one more thing is like when everybody was surprised. I mean, this BJP just simply mentioned, and I think Vajpayee also did that. Like this was in our match, so there's nothing new because many of the opposition parties had countered, saying that the opposition need to be taken into confidence, and this was never in the plans. So, and even like when the Western experts were surprised, I mean, it was like right in front of them, but they missed it. Like it was explicitly in the election manifesto, and they still missed it. You know.
That's correct, yes. And primarily the opposition came from the extreme left and also the socialist parties who had been thrown out of power in the recently concluded elections,
Yeah, and even
like
like
Mr.
the
Chandrasekhar.
yeah, and even like Congress, certain sections of the Congress party also vigorously protested it. Like for example, like Sonia Gandhi mentioned that like true responsibility comes in restraint and not display of shakti, was her statement. I'm just paraphrasing that.
Yeah, that was the time when the leadership also had changed hands in the Congress party. So
Hmm.
up until that time, under PV Narasimha Rao, Congress used to have a different outlook
Yeah.
towards the nuclear weapons testing, but
Hmm.
thereafter, under Sonia Gandhi, the policy
Yeah,
of the
PV
Congress party
Narasimha Rao.
changed.
So that's why, like, I think he's was a very good prime minister that he had like strategic clarity of thought. So, do you think like if they had won the election in '96, we would have tested in '96?
Yes, I think they would have. I think it has already been mentioned in a few places already, and they were waiting to win back mandate again and go
Mm-hmm.
ahead with testing. So I think it was already clear by then. Okay, so what happened thereafter was that the United Nations Security Council adopted a resolution condemning both India and Pakistan and demanding that both countries refrain from engaging in further tests. As a result, the United States cut off all military support, diplomatic assistance, and foreign assistance, including from the IMF and World Bank. Overall, the effect of international sanctions on the Indian economy was minimal, And this was yet another victory for Vajpayee, since many opposition parties had resorted to scaremongering, saying that the economic sanctions would result in slowing down of the Indian economy. If you see the GDP data of those years, there
Mm-hmm.
was absolutely no doubt that the impact on the Indian economy was absolutely minimal.
Yeah,
So,
yeah. I mean, yeah, I remember, like, I think it was former Prime Minister H.D. Devagoda, who was one of the prime ministers in between, said that, like, he didn't want the rural masses to get affected by sanctions. So he didn't go ahead with the testing because he was worried about the economic impact of the testing.
correct. Correct, yes. Okay, so one implication of all this was that the Vajpayee administration, uh, uh, in effect of being subjected to international sanctions, actually decided to engage with the Clinton administration, and Jaswant Singh, who was then the Minister of External Affairs, and a person by name Strobe Talbot, who was a Deputy Secretary of State. They both met 14 times in less than 2 years. These initiatives helped in building the trust between India and the US, and by the March of 2000, which was less than 2 years thereafter, the sanctions were lifted, and Bill Clinton became the first US president to visit India in 22 years after Jimmy Carter in 1978. Now, during this visit, the two sides signed a comprehensive document called India Relations Vision for the 21st Century, and this laid the foundation to transform the India-US ties. And this in itself was actually a very, very big achievement for the Vajpayee government to have the US president lift the sanctions and also visit India within 24 months was a victory of sorts for the Vajpayee administration.
Yeah, I mean,
And
looking at it, is like, if I don't know if many people underestimate this development, because in like a short span of 2 years, you went from completely antagonistic relationship with a severe response in terms of economic sanctions from the US and India to sort of like now being on very good terms within 2 years. It's a significant diplomatic achievement for India, which I don't
absolutely.
think if many people give the credit to the administration for having to do some difficult behind the scenes negotiations to come at this point.
Right, agree. So, as a part of the return visit, Vajpayee actually in September 2000 coined the term natural allies to define US and India relations. Vajpayee told the Asia Society while he was addressing there that while he was addressing there that it was his belief that when the history of Indo-US partnership was written, the 6 month period between March and September, beginning with Clinton's visit to India and culminating with Vajpayee's return visit, would be seen as the defining moment in the bilateral ties. He also said that his visit to Washington, had consolidated relations between the world's two largest democracies and marked a new era in bilateral and global affairs. He made it amply clear to the US that all along it had made a mistake in framing India in a hyphenated relationship with Pakistan.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, back then, everything, all the US policy had to be like India and Pakistan had to be considered together. So this was the beginning of the time where the hyphenation between Pakistan and India started to get separated. Like, you could look at a policy and just look at in terms of how we will deal with India versus trying to make sure that Pakistan also taken into account for. And one more point I wanted to make is, this is a significant this natural allies thing is a significant shift, because see, like, from probably like 1971, I think, when they signed the Treaty of Friendship, like US Indian relations had always drifted towards the Soviet Union. But now, like, Vajpayee saw that, like, you don't need to be bound by the straitjacket or the orthodoxy of the Congress party in primarily, which was in power, that you always need to be aligned with the Soviet Union. Like, he saw that there were benefits of aligning with the US, which was a taboo subject in terms of many in the Congress party. So he saw the vision that okay, we cannot be like a pariah for the United States. We need to work closely with them because we have shared goals and common interests. So, but that didn't mean that you completely go to the US side. So, I think I want to share a tidbit on that. So, during the second Gulf War, when US was had that coalition of willing, and he was looking for allies to join its force to invade Iraq versus Saddam Hussein, one of the interesting developments was that there was a request by US and George Bush to join the alliance. So, I mean, there was some talk within the Indian government, the NDA government, that we should join the this coalition. But Vajpayee wasn't too keen on it. So the way he got around to dropping this idea was interesting. So back then, Vajpayee used to be good friends with CPIM, like Communist Party of India General Secretary Harkishan Singh Surjit, and the Communist Party of India counterpart AB Bardhan. So he invited them for a cup of tea, and they did chit chatted about like old times. And then suddenly Vajpayee popped the question to say like, hey, what do you think about deployment of Indian troops to Iraq? And the communists, who were like always opposed to US, quickly said like, hey, this is a bad idea, we shouldn't do. So then Vajpayee suddenly said like, okay, but if you're opposing, I don't see any opposition or protest against this plan, like, so that gave the left parties the signal. The very next day, the left launched countrywide protests against sending troops to Iraq. So in a roundabout way, Vajpayee got what he wanted to do, but he got the leftists to do his work for him. That he got them to make any right-wing hawks in the Indian government who wanted to send troops to Iraq now completely dropped the idea because it was politically impalatable to the current government. So this shows like the mechanisms how Vajpayee used to get his things done, which never was direct but sometimes indirect mechanisms.
Fascinating. Only
Yeah.
re-emphasizes the point that he was a much loud politician across the political spectrum.
Yeah, he was like a smart, and he uses relationships very well. So
Absolutely.
this shift that like Kishore you mentioned, that also I think set the tempo of a further improvement in the bilateral India US ties. So when like Vajpayee demitted office like in 2004, like, and Manmohan Singh, like, he managed to get the US to pass the 123 agreement for the transfer of civil nuclear technology to India, which is like referred to as the Indo-US nuclear deal. So like what Vajpayee started this strategic, I wouldn't say like maybe shift, maybe a drift towards the US. Uh, like Manmohan Singh carried it further, and then I think we can see that today Modi has carried even further than what is. So it was a slowly gradual movement across the political spectrum over these years, but the initial movement was done by Vajpayee following the Pokhran nuclear tests.
Totally agree. And in fact, what has been mentioned is that once the US passed the 123 amendment, Manmohan Singh had personally visited Vajpayee and had explained to him that he had finished off what Vajpayee had started.
Oh,
So,
okay.
that kind of goes to show what kind of respect even Manmohan Singh had for Atal Bihari Vajpayee.
Yeah,
So
that's
that's
interesting. I
about
didn't know that.
yeah, so that's about the Indo-US relationships. Quickly moving on to the India's reach out to Pakistan and the Lahore Bus Yatra of February 1999. Now, much has been written about Vajpayee's initiative of peace with Pakistan. Basically, he sought normalization of ties with Pakistan, reasoning that one can change their friends but had to live with one's neighbors. His famous
Yeah,
quote was that you can change your history, you can change your friends, but you can never change your geography.
yeah. I
So,
think that's
so
the bane of India since the independence, that we have two unfriendly neighbors on our borders.
Absolutely. Okay. So, yeah, so in that regard, Vajpayee had a bus ride to Lahore in February 1999, followed by a visit to Minar-e-Pakistan in Lahore. Now, if you know about Minar-e-Pakistan, it is actually considered to be a national monument in out there in Pakistan. So Vajpayee visited the monument and wrote in the visitor's book there that India wanted Pakistan to be a sovereign and prosperous nation. And it was the first time that an Indian leader had emphasized Pakistani sovereignty. And especially significant this was because it was coming from him, as RSS had always indicated that it wanted an Akhand Bharat, an undivided India. So this was kind of significant, and it kind of helped in building bridges with the people and the establishment in Pakistan. And the very next day, both Vajpayee and the Pakistani Prime Minister, the then Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif, signed the Lahore Declaration, wherein it was stated that there would be a broad set of commitments to work towards nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation, and both of them would commit to non-interference in each other's internal affairs, and also intensify efforts to resolve Kashmir crisis. So at that point in time, the media in Pakistan and the media in India were both gung-ho about the Lahore Declaration, and both the governments were actually very, very popular at that moment in time. And people and the opposition parties also, both in across the border, had actually lauded the two governments for having taken up this initiative.
Yeah, but the this newfound bonhomie like didn't last long, because just the next year in the summer, like India had found that Pakistani army regulars had,
In the same year,
yeah.
within
Oh,
three
sorry, in the
months.
same year. Sorry, my bad. So in like the within 3 months, they found that the Pakistani army had infiltrated into Kargil in Kashmir, and that posed a challenge for India. So the Indian army like did fight bravely to regain the control over the mountains in Kargil sector. So at that time, like, that was interesting that Vajpayee had two types of was under intense pressure two ways. So one was to broaden the scope of the war from just the Kargil sector in Kashmir to all across the international border, and there was a lot of internal pressure from India which it didn't succumb to, and also the other was the external pressure. So Pakistan, with its then friend United States, was trying to uh, I mean, Nawaz Sharif tried to pressure Bill Clinton to have India back off because they were reeling under the pounding they were taking from the Indian Army and the Indian Air Force. But Vajpayee stood firm that actually even Clinton invited Vajpayee to a conference in Washington. But like Vajpayee said, like that held firm that unless Pakistan withdraws its troops from the up to the line of control or behind it, there would be no further talks with Pakistan. So that was the
And
Kargil part of it.
another context for the Kargil war was that India and Pakistan were still reeling under the economic sanctions. So there was no way India would get any help from the US in terms of logistics or in terms of intelligence. So this was a war that India fought with one hand tied to its back, and
Yeah.
it had to get any help from anywhere around, and that was where it got help from Russia and Israel. And India acknowledged the help that it got from Russia, from Israel much later, maybe almost a decade and a half later.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, that was about the Kargil, the Lahore Bus Yatra and the Kargil backstab. Now, what happened thereafter was that the government fell immediately within the next 2 months, owing to a political fluid situation back home. But then fresh elections were held, and an improved mandate in October of that year led to Vajpayee returning as the prime minister, something that was possible only for Nehru and Indira Gandhi prior to that. However, immediately after becoming the prime minister yet again, within the next 2 months, there was a rare diplomatic failure for Vajpayee, coming in the form of IC 814 hijacking. Mohal, you as a kid, me as a kid, or maybe we were teenagers by then, we clearly remember watching the news channels back then, where every aspect of the flight hijacking of IC-814, which was originating from Kathmandu and destined to land in Delhi, got hijacked. Got
Mm-hmm.
hijacked after it entered Indian airspace. It landed in Amritsar, but somehow they managed to escape from there. It landed in Lahore, it went to Dubai, and finally it managed to land in Kandahar in Afghanistan. Now, the entire episode got live streaming in all Indian media channels,
Mm-hmm.
and that kind of arose the interest in the common public out here in India, and I have vivid memories of that episode. In any case, the hijackers of the IC-814 belonged to the terror group Harkatul Mujahideen, and they demanded the release of three hardcore terrorists who were housed in Indian jails. They were Mushtaq Ahmad Hargar, Ahmad Omar Saeed Sheikh, and Maulana Masood Azhar. Maulana Masood Azhar is a well-known name today in India. Now, what happened was that India was unable to make the US and UAE to use their influence to help secure a quick release of the passengers. India did not have any kind of diplomatic links with Taliban, so India was on the back foot, trying to secure the release of the people in the flight IC-814, and we all know that India had to reluctantly agree to exchange the three terrorists
Yeah,
for
I
the
think there
people
was a lot of
in the
public
flight.
pressure. A lot of public pressure
And
had built up, and the government succumbed to that pressure, unfortunately, in releasing. And like Masood Azhar, as you mentioned, like even today, we are regretting that we let him go
absolutely.
because he's been fomenting terror in India by while sitting in Pakistan.
And much to contribute to that was actually the immature media handling, wherein media tried to whip up the frenzy and sentiment during that time, the week-long hijack episode that it lasted. So Indian government had kind of no other option but to succumb to the
Yeah,
pressure.
like one of the
However,
first.
right, yeah, go ahead.
No, one of the first instances of like reality TV in India.
Absolutely, yeah, that's the point I was trying to make. Anyway, however, India now has a very tough anti-hijacking law, which advocates capital punishment in the event of death of any person during the hijack process.
I hope we have a better process to deal with hijacking because they let the plane to take off from Amritsar instead of, like, say, blowing out the tires or taking some steps to prevent the takeoff, which would have resulted in a very different end game, out there. So,
Mind you, we
anyways,
have we have far better standard operating procedures now.
oh yeah, I hope so. So, the one of the lessons learned from the Kargil intelligence failure and the fiasco was that Kargil review committee was set up immediately after the Kargil war and was headed by K. Subramaniam, a former civil servant. So, the National Security Council agency tasked with so one of the outcomes was the National Security Council was formed, so which is basically tasked with advising the Prime Minister's office on matters of national security and strategic interest. And it was formed in like November 1998 with Brajesh Mishra as like the first national security advisor. Also, one of the other recommendations of the committee was setting up the Tri Services Theatre Command in Andaman and Nicobar Islands, just to have jointness of operations between the three armed forces of India, and
Hmm.
also setting up the Strategic Forces Command, which has control of the India's nuclear weapons and delivery, and also the Integrated Defense Staff. So there are like quite a few recommendations. I mean, some of the recommendations have not been fully implemented from the Kargil Review Committee, but a lot good did come out of it from the
Yeah.
report.
Right, right. So, Vajpayee was not a man who would easily give up just because the earlier attempts to establish permanent peace with Pakistan had failed. So, what did he do? He he invited Musharraf, who by then had become the president of Pakistan in July 2001. He invited Musharraf to Agra. This was the famous Agra summit. However, unfortunately, the summit again failed spectacularly in front of the glaring media cameras. This was yet another live reality show unraveling in front of the Indian audiences who were glued on to their TV sets. Now, what happened was that Musharraf, on the day of the summit, somehow managed to have a breakfast meeting with the Indian media, and he had openly indicated that the resolution of the Kashmir dispute was the only open dispute between India and Pakistan, and this kind of did not go well with the Indian establishment, who were left embarrassed. And even when a draft statement was being prepared, there was no mention of cross-border terrorism, which by then had become a major sticking point between India and Pakistan. So the Indian side disagreed to have to do anything with this kind of a draft statement where cross-border terrorism would not be mentioned, and Musharraf was not gonna be forced or coerced into adding that phrase into the summit statement. So this was the reason that it kind of failed spectacularly, and with no way out, Musharraf headed back fuming and claiming that India had not agreed, and India had let the summit fail. Once again, Vajpayee was left heartbroken in his attempt to establish lasting peace with Pakistan.
Yeah, and this was followed in the end of the year by an attack on the Indian Parliament by terrorists out of Pakistan. So, in response, India did mobilize around like 5 lakh troops and three armored divisions onto Pakistan's border in preparation for war. So interestingly, like Vajpayee did resist the pressures to go to war. So in an interview with Shekhar Gupta, he mentions that he asked Vajpayee, "Are you going to war?" So Vajpayee, after a pause, said that like everybody wants me to go to war. The army, the people, everybody's angry at Pakistan. He says everybody wants to start a war, but you can decide how to start a war, but you cannot decide how to stop a war. So he saw the strategic foresight that the war he could start, but there was no way that he didn't know what was the end goal. Also, when he asked the army what was the end goal of the war, they didn't have any other a good response except saying that the strategic objective was just to punish Pakistan, which wasn't good enough for him. So at great cost, like he did resist the urge to go to war back then. So towards the end of the term, the other adversary like India that India has China, like Vajpayee did invest some effort in trying to make the relations better. So in July 2003, he went to Beijing on a state visit and met with the Chinese President Hu Jintao. Now, both declared to a joint declaration that both of the two countries don't see each other as a threat. And interestingly, like India said that they would recognize the Tibetan Autonomous Region as a part of China, while like China agreed to have the Changu in Sikkim as a border trading post, implying that China was de facto recognizing Sikkim as a part of India. So that was a recognition by China that Sikkim is a part of India and the Tibetan Autonomous Region is a part of China. However, I believe the most important outcome of the Vajpayee's visit to Beijing was the setting up of a special representative mechanism, where I believe the national security advisors of the two countries would meet together to try to resolve the long pending border dispute that has plagued the two countries for like probably 50, 60 years. So the special representative mechanism over the years has seen up to like almost 20 plus rounds of talks so far, and progress has been made towards a resolution of the 4,000-kilometer unresolved boundary between India and China, but the final resolution is yet to come.
Yeah, it is a
So
work in progress as we speak. Okay, so looking at all the events that unfolded from 1978 to 2004, it is clear that while Vajpayee came up with his own ideas to solve long pending complex issues like with Pakistan and China, he also was very sure of the kind of outcomes he wished to see. For example, he clearly knew that he wanted India US to be natural allies, and he prevailed on the US administration to look at the bilateral ties in the same way. While carrying out all his plans, he was a pragmatic optimist. He would never shy away from repeatedly engaging with Pakistan. Similarly, he would never feel threatened to engage Beijing with his unique ideas of border resolution mechanisms. Uh, in the past week, China acknowledged the demise of Mr. Vajpayee and also sang eulogies in his honor. Pakistan too sent a large delegation to attend Mr. Vajpayee's funeral. All these imply that he was popular not only within the country and among the masses in the country, but also with the nation's adversaries, with whom he had tried to engage all through his life.
Yeah, I mean, one of the foremost striking things about Vajpayee was that he had a clear-headed vision of what his foreign policy would be, and he went about executing it. So, like very early in his term, he said India has to be a overtly nuclear weapon state, and he went about testing of the nuclear weapons. And even with his foreign policy, be it Pakistan, I mean, he did fail, but he went on trying again and again because he knew that having good relations with our neighbor was of paramount importance. And also with China, I mean, he did have a bad experience in the 1978 visit, and also relations with China after the nuclear testing wasn't good because I believe in a letter to US he said that China was the reason that we had to go overtly nuclear. So it was a clear change that in 2003 from 1998 the relations with China had improved so much that they were willing to host him on a visit, and also a few days ago eulogizing him when he passed away. So that was he was a great thinker and a visionary, and some of the the drift towards the deepening of the ties with the US is something that we are reaping the benefits as a nation even today, like probably like what 15 20 years after the his policies have been were implemented.
And also with Israel.
Yeah, but
Yeah,
yeah, that's also true.
yeah.
But I mean that
Okay,
like PV Narasimha Rao also had started some of it, so yeah, it was like a continuation of some of Narasimha Rao's policies. But yeah, Vajpayee did deepen the relationship during that time.
absolutely. So that wraps up our discussion on the work carried out by Mr. Atal Bihari Vajpayee in the realm of foreign policy. We cannot claim to have covered everything, nor could we have explained each topic in minute detail owing to time constraints. Yet, we assume you have liked our episode. To hear more such intriguing conversations between the two of us, we urge you to subscribe to our channel India Rising and also tap on the bell icon to be notified whenever a new episode goes public. If you have any comments or suggestions on any topics you wish to hear upon, do let us know. Until the next episode, here is our farewell to one of the finest Prime Ministers India ever had, if not the finest. Shri Atal Bihari Vajpayee, Padma Vibhushan and Bharat Ratna, Om Shanti.